Hello everyone, today we conclude the circle about the Justinian production for actually the context for it today in our manualistic history of law, taking a look properly at the pre-Justinian legal collections that, as you know, were fundamentally the base on which, in part, at least a very important part of which, the Saint Justinian collection was eventually created, and in particular, naturally, the Theodosian Code. Right. Today we can't introduce the history of Roman law as such, but just looking at essentially what was like the late empire about relatively to properly legislative activity, because up to the beginning of the 4th century AD, the legislative activity of the Roman emperors was expressed in provisions that we can talk about in terms of edicta, mandata, and rescripta, especially the latter particularly used in Diocletian's time, right? And such provisions cited the traditional normative sources such as the leges and the senatus consulta. With Constantine, this situation began to change. Right? It was affirmed at that time in a growing way the idea for which the emperor, in virtue of his superior authority, was provided with the exclusive act of normative imperium, command, inspired to the principles of equity and rationality. And consequently, from one side, the traditional legislative sources began at this point to lose in value, and they ended up not to be, to be recognized only because founded on the imperial legislative majesty. On the other hand, the previous normative acts of the prince entered gradually they fell out of use fundamentally, with the only exception of the rescriptum that did not disappear, but to be substituted altogether by the lex generalis. That is, in virtue of its, absolutely imperative form, right? It's the fact it was addressing a people or a region, or sometimes even the whole empire, with the abstraction and the generality of the imperium of command, the order of the functionary to which was addressed the provision, so that the subjects could be really capable of recognizing it. And this form, the lex generalis, was considered the most idonious form to manifest the will of the absolute sovereign and to essentially update the law in a more rapid and effective as possible way, in the name of the principles of justice and equity. And imperial law, by the way, was not the only juridical source of Roman law, right? Next to it was another formal source, that one constituted by jurisprudence as such, that is, the opinions that the opinion expressed properly by those jurists that had received from the emperor, from which the authority still emanated, the so-called ius respondendi, right? So their response were properly, to have, they were a sort of emanation of imperial majesty, and to which the judges normally turned for the resolution of disputes, and these opinions were indicated with the name of jura, of right, proper. And then there were also the local customs that kept operating. This was often a non-formal source, right? It was not written most of the times, but it was of great significance, since it expressed in an immediate way the specific and varied needs of the single communities that resided in the enormously vast imperial territory. So in the 4th century, by the way, there is the important turning point in the system of juridical sources under yet another aspect, because this was the time in which among the jurists start spreading the need to systematize in unitary collections the two great sources, that is essentially, as we've seen, the imperial legislation and the juridical literature. So a great time of reorganization, of rationalization. Why? Because the Roman Empire had produced, just like a customary law, an enormous amount of legal material. Right? With the time, these sources had become so many, right? So extremely abundant, and they presented also lots of confusions and contradictions internally. And as an expression of such need were the private works that arrived in incomplete form, such as the Fragmenta Juris Romani Vaticana, that is a collection of 341 fragments datable to the 4th century, that essentially reunites passages of classical jurists such as Papinianus, Paulus, and Ulpianus, and imperial constitutions drawn from, let's say, partly from the Gregorian and Hermogenean codices that we will see. The Collatio Legum Mosaicarum et Romanarum, datable to the end of the 4th century, which proposes a comparison between the Roman, in fact, and Mosaic ones, as you understand from the title, that reunites together with passages of works by Gaius, Papinianus, Paulus, Ulpianus, and Modestinus, constitutions drawn from the aforementioned codices, the Gregorian and the Hermogenean. Also the Consulatio Veteris Coiusdam Juris Consulti from the end of the 4th, beginning of the 5th century, which in the text that we have gotten from it is basically a re-edition of the end of the 5th century, right, of the original text, that presents laws drawn not just from the Gregorian and Hermogenean codices, but also from the Codex Theodosianus, together with passages of Paulus. Now, this is very interesting because, as you understand, for the first time, there is not just a broader collection of different material, but probably also an exegesis of the same. Right here, we've seen Roman Mosaic law together. Certain passages that were selected to be because they were deemed as more important from the most famous jurists' Roman tradition, and put together with these other sources, and so on. So there is the need of a systematization of. We could digress on the reasons why did this happen at the political, social level. Maybe we'll look at it in a dedicated video, but it's easy to guess, right? It's specifically about this need, together with the Perpetua Sanctio, that in fact drew from the Theodosian Code, was the broader resystematization of the empire in late Roman times in an ever more autarchic way from the side of the emperors and their monarchic power, to give a specific order, specific guideline, specific form to legal practice, which was, as we will see, properly contracted, because there wasn't much of a dramatic legal activity as much as there had been in the early empire at this point. Society was, in a sense, more simple, right? There was less, activity. Here it's very complicated to make it simple, really, because in the whole empire, lots of, there were completely different realities at this point. But it's obvious that, especially in certain areas, and it's very important also to see where these collections came from. There was we can read a specific picture of the society of the time. There is, however, instead this Codex Gregorianus and Codex Hermogenianus that reunite instead only the leges of some collections that date back, in fact, to the Gregorianus was composed under Diocletian in 292, 293. It basically collected all the constitutions from since the time of Hadrian. The Codex Hermogenianus followed the first, and it comprehended laws of Diocletian. These were both private collections, as we were saying before. It's not just a public need, but it's properly also about the practicality of law. And these works also are not complete. That is, they're probably not didn't pass down to us entirely as the original texts. We know only some constitutions through the Lex Romana Visigotorum, for example, and as we were saying before, the Fragmenta Vaticana, the Collatio and the Consultatio as well. The official work of the empire, instead, for universal value, was not renowningly enough the Codex Theodosianus that gave fundamentally the base for the St. Justinian's collection. So in 429, Emperor Theodosius II instituted a commission of jurists with the task to proceed to the collection both of leges and of jura. The initiative, however, didn't have much of a success, and in 435 the emperor nominated a new commission, entrusting it the less ambitious task to proceed with the collection of the only leges starting from Constantine. Right? So that makes you understand also properly at the beginning of this broader resystematization how many difficulties, properly from a methodological organizational point of view, also these imperial jurists had now to squeeze everything into one single codex that had to be systematic with juridical categories, etc., institutions, etc. Well, that's also why the Justinian Code owes so much to the previous Theodosian work. So in February 438, the Codex Theodosianus, that was articulated in 16 books, was promulgated by the emperor. The nature of the leges collection appears particularly interesting because, first of all, these reunited ancient and more recent laws, not much, say, to build like a monument of the past, destined to celebrate, a lost time. On the contrary, there was a practical purpose here to give order and coordination to a complex, to a normative complex that would be enforced properly. So the imperial law, in other words, was intended as the expression of the perennity and of the majesty without time and without space of the emperor. This took the name of perpetua sanctio, as it's defined, for example, by the same Codex Theodosianus. So this law had to come to order the universe, right, as an ecumenic system that had to reflect divine perfection through imperial majesty on earth. So this tells you so much also about the Byzantine world as it started to be formed, like properly a crystallization of certain norms as conceived as perfection, whereas the early Roman law had been just as it came out, as a customary law, right, for contingential practice and purpose. This was as well, but it added, so it was functional still for that society, but it added this patina of properly of unchangeability, right? The idea that this was perfect as a system and that this was reflected by the empire in itself. So the imperial law seems thus to have been accredited as provided almost of a sacral nature, right? It is the expression of an eternal potestas, as that is directed as such to translate into positive right as superior principle of equity, justice, and rationality. And by the way, the collections didn't owe their extraordinary significance just to the material, the leges that they reunited. It was their same nature to be considered of elevated value because they realized the reductio ad unum of the normative material up to that point dispersed into an immensity of volumes, and thus they provided the jurists and other interpreters of that unitary text specifically that appeared as harmonic, clear, outlining imperial laws, and that was considered indispensable for the certainty of law. And this second aspect is, for example, highlighted clearly relatively to the, for the Codex Theodosianus by the Gesta Senatus Romani de Theodosiano Publicando. That is fundamentally the summary of a Roman senatorial session in which the same codex was presented in December 438. And the same need of order was felt, as we were saying, relatively to this literally enormously based material of juridical doctrine that had accumulated during the Roman Empire. And in the 5th century, however, this didn't manage to express itself in a proper unitary collection of jura that, as we've seen, had been left out by the codex. There were only the leges. But he, however, inspired that imperial constitution that attempted to stem the confusion and the contradiction of the sources that is fundamentally the laws of the citations emanated by Valentinian III in 426. That dictated practical rules that could concur to eliminate the important, evil, let's say, and the anarchy that was lived in daily in juridical practice. So the law citations disposed that in the judgments, for judging the matter, there had to be just a set of 5 jurists, Papinianus, Paulus, Gaius, Ulpianus, and Modestinus, that could be referenced to. So, and that in the eventuality of a contrast in their interpretation, the thesis supported by the majority of the aforementioned masters had to prevail, and in case of parity, had to be preferred the thesis of Papinianus. Right, it's an interesting criterion of authoritativeness. So in the law had the law in itself had the double effect, let's say, to exclude from one side the thought of the older jurists, right? Also because the texts of the older jurists by the 5th century were practically not to be found anymore, right? Properly in terms of circulation, of accessibility, they simply weren't out there, and their quote thus was difficultly controllable by the judges, right? And they're to limitate, on the other, the traditional freedom of the judge to choose the doctrine to which refer. And to tradition, however, law turned in the moment in which confirmed the validity of jurisprudence of the previous age, and stressing of it the actual value, in fact, in preference of contemporary doctrine. specific, because the jurisprudence inspired to the superior principles of justice and rationality thus seems to have been recognized an eternal authority that is completely similar to the one of the leges generalis of the prince, like it was in the early empire. For now, we stop it here. For now, I just hope that you really enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, do a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.